They called him a coward. They called him a fool. His own commanding officers tried to have him court-martialed and kicked out of the army. His fellow soldiers beat him, mocked him, and told him he'd get them all killed. But on May 5th, 1945, on a blood-soaked cliff in Okinawa, this same man, armed with nothing but his faith and his bare hands, would single-handedly save 75 lives, while every bullet, grenade, and shell in the Japanese arsenal tried to end his. This is the story of Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who became the first man to receive the Medal of Honor, without ever firing a single shot in combat. If you're enjoying this story of incredible courage and conviction, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss more amazing true stories like this one. Desmond Doss grew up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia during the Great Depression, the son of a carpenter and a devout Seventh-day Adventist mother. His childhood was humble, marked by poverty and hard work, but it was also shaped by two experiences that would define the rest of his life. The first was a picture that hung in his family's home, a painting of Cain killing Abel. Young Desmond would stare at that image, horrified by the violence of brother against brother, and it planted something deep in his conscience about the sanctity of human life. The second experience was far more personal and traumatic. One day, during a heated argument between his father and uncle, both men drunk and angry, his father pulled a gun. Desmond's mother grabbed young Desmond and told him to run and fetch the police. By the time he returned, she had wrestled the gun away from his father, and she quietly handed it to Desmond with instructions to hide it where it could never be found. That moment, seeing how close his own father came to committing murder, cemented in Desmond's mind that he could never, ever take another person's life. When Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941, America plunged into war, and millions of young men rushed to enlist. Desmond Doss was working at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, in a job that could have granted him deferment from military service. He could have stayed home, safe and comfortable, contributing to the war effort from a distance. But Desmond didn't see it that way. He believed deeply in his country and in the cause of stopping fascism. He wanted to serve. He wanted to do his part. There was just one problem. His religious convictions as a Seventh-day Adventist meant he could not kill. He wouldn't touch a weapon. He wouldn't train on a rifle. He wouldn't even work on the Sabbath, from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. So in April 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the United States Army as a conscientious objector, requesting to serve as a combat medic. The military didn't know what to do with him. Conscientious objectors usually served in non-combat roles, far from the front lines, but Desmond insisted he wanted to be right there in the thick of battle, saving lives. His drill sergeants and commanding officers were bewildered, then frustrated, then outright hostile. How could they trust a man who wouldn't carry a rifle? How could they rely on someone who refused to kill the enemy? His company commander, Captain Glover, openly stated that he didn't want Desmond in his unit. He tried everything to get Doss to quit or to have him discharged. His fellow soldiers were even worse. They saw him as a liability, a weakling, someone whose religious convictions would get them killed. They mocked him relentlessly. They called him a coward to his face. One night, several men in his barracks beat him while he slept. The harassment was constant and brutal, designed to break him, to force him to either pick up a rifle or leave the army entirely. But Desmond Doss wouldn't break. He endured every insult, every beating, every humiliation with quiet determination. He completed every training exercise, running the same obstacle courses, doing the same grueling drills as everyone else, but always without a weapon. When his superiors ordered him to train with a rifle, he politely but firmly refused. When they threatened him with court-martial, he stood his ground. His commanding officers even denied him leave to go home and marry his sweetheart, Dorothy Shoulda. But Desmond found a way, getting married in his uniform and then immediately returning to duty. The army tried one final time to get rid of him, bringing him up on charges for refusing to obey orders. But at the hearing, his former commander from basic training spoke up in his defense, explaining that Doss was not a coward or a troublemaker. He was a man of genuine conviction who wanted to serve his country, just in his own way. The charges were dropped, and Desmond Doss was officially designated as a non-combatant and assigned to the 77th Infantry Division as a combat medic. His unit shipped out to the Pacific Theater, where they would face some of the most brutal combat of World War II. Their first taste of battle came on the island of Guam in 1944, and it was here that Desmond Doss began to prove himself. While his fellow soldiers had been trained to kill the enemy, Desmond had trained himself to save the wounded. When the bullets started flying and men started falling, Desmond ran toward the sound of screaming, not away from it. He crawled through machine gun fire to reach wounded soldiers, dragging them back to safety while explosions tore up the ground around him. He treated injuries under fire, working with steady hands even as mortars landed mere feet away. The men who had once beaten him and called him a coward began to see something different. They saw a man with courage that didn't come from a gun, but from something deeper, something unshakable. After Guam came Leyte in the Philippines, where the fighting was even more intense. Desmond continued his work, running into danger again and again to pull wounded men from the battlefield. He became known for his speed, his skill, and his absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. Men who had once wanted nothing to do with him now specifically requested to fight alongside him, knowing that if they were hit, Doss would come for them no matter what. He was building a reputation, but the true test of Desmond Doss, the moment that would define his entire life, was still ahead. In April 1945, the 77th Infantry Division received their orders. They were going to Okinawa, a strategic island just 340 miles from mainland Japan. The Japanese had transformed Okinawa into a fortress, with elaborate tunnel systems, hidden artillery positions, and thousands of soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the death. At the center of the American advance was a 400-foot escarpment that the soldiers nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. It was a sheer cliff face that could only be climbed using cargo nets and rope ladders, and at the top, the Japanese had established a killing zone with interlocking fields of fire. Taking Hacksaw Ridge was going to be a nightmare. On April 29th, Doss and his battalion scaled the cargo nets and reached the top of the ridge. For a few days, they managed to hold their position, but the Japanese were everywhere, emerging from hidden tunnels and bunkers to attack from all directions. The Americans were taking heavy casualties, but they held the line. Then came May 5th, 1945, the day that would become legend. The Japanese launched a massive counterattack just before dawn, hitting the American positions with everything they had: mortars, artillery, machine gun fire, and waves of soldiers charging with bayonets and grenades. The fighting was apocalyptic, hand-to-hand combat in the mud and blood, explosions everywhere, screams cutting through the smoke. The Americans fought desperately, but they were being overwhelmed. The order came down to retreat, to fall back down the cliff and regroup. The able-bodied soldiers scrambled for the cargo nets and began climbing down to safety. But there were men left behind. Dozens of them, wounded and unable to move, scattered across the top of Hacksaw Ridge. To leave them there meant certain death, either from their wounds or from the Japanese soldiers who would soon overrun the position. Every other American soldier was retreating down the cliff. Every single one. Except Desmond Doss. While everyone else climbed down to safety, Desmond stayed on top of that ridge, alone, surrounded by enemy soldiers, and he began to work. He crawled through the chaos, through the smoke and fire and death, searching for wounded men. When he found one, he would check their injuries, bandage what he could, and then drag them to the edge of the cliff. He had devised a rope sling system, a simple bowline knot that he could loop under a man's arms, and he would lower them down the sheer cliff face one by one, using the same cargo nets the battalion had climbed up. After each man reached the bottom, Desmond would pull the rope back up and go find another. For 5 hours, Desmond Doss worked alone on top of Hacksaw Ridge. Japanese soldiers were hunting for American survivors. Bullets were snapping past his head. Grenades were exploding all around him. Mortar shells were cratering the earth, and Desmond just kept going. He would find a wounded man, often delirious or unconscious, and he would reassure them, "You're going to be okay. I've got you." Then he'd drag them across open ground, sometimes 100 yards or more, always exposed to enemy fire, always moving toward that cliff edge. Some of the men he saved weighed close to 200 pounds. Desmond himself weighed maybe 140, but he hauled them anyway, fueled by adrenaline and faith and sheer determination. Each time he lowered a man over the edge, he would pray the same prayer. "Dear God, please help me get one more. Just one more." Then he'd pull up the rope and go back for another. One more. One more. One more. That prayer became his mantra, his driving force through those 5 hours of hell. He didn't count the men he was saving. He didn't have time. He just knew there were more wounded soldiers out there, and he couldn't leave until he'd found them all. At one point, a wounded soldier begged Desmond to leave him and save himself. Desmond refused, dragged him to the cliff, and lowered him down. Another time, Desmond came across a soldier so badly wounded that most medics would have considered him beyond help. Desmond spent precious minutes stabilizing him, then got him to the cliff edge and down to safety. That soldier survived. The Japanese were everywhere, and several times they came close enough to spot Desmond, but somehow, through luck, divine intervention, or some combination of both, he evaded capture or death. He moved through smoke and shadows, always one step ahead of the enemy, always finding just enough cover to shield himself as he worked. By the time the sun began to set, and Desmond finally lowered the last wounded soldier down Hacksaw Ridge, he had saved 75 men. 75 American soldiers who would have died on that ridge went home to their families because one unarmed medic refused to leave them behind. When Desmond finally climbed down that cliff himself, exhausted and covered in blood, none of it his own, his fellow soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some of them had assumed he was dead. Others thought he must have retreated with everyone else. But here he was, alive, and behind him on the ground at the base of the cliff were dozens of wounded men who were also alive because of him. The same soldiers who had once beaten him and called him a coward now looked at him with something close to awe. But Desmond Doss wasn't done. 3 weeks later, his unit was engaged in another brutal fight near a Japanese stronghold. Desmond was treating wounded soldiers when a grenade landed near him. Instead of diving away to save himself, Desmond deliberately placed his body between the grenade and the wounded men he was treating. The explosion tore into his legs, embedding over a dozen pieces of shrapnel, but the men he'd been protecting survived. Severely wounded, Desmond still refused to call for help, insisting that his fellow medics treat other soldiers who were worse off. He waited 5 hours for treatment, and when stretcher bearers finally came for him, they came under fire. Seeing another soldier wounded nearby, Desmond rolled off his own stretcher and insisted the other man be evacuated first. While waiting again, enemy fire shattered his arm with a bullet that splintered the bone. Desmond crawled 300 yards to an aid station, and even then, he was still trying to help treat other wounded soldiers with his one functioning arm. Desmond Doss spent the next 5.5 years in and out of hospitals. The grenade blast had cost him most of one lung, and tuberculosis nearly killed him. He lost ribs and eventually had to have part of his remaining lung removed. He lost hearing in one ear from the explosions. The shrapnel in his legs caused him pain for the rest of his life. But none of that mattered on October 12, 1945, when President Harry Truman draped the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck on the White House lawn. Desmond became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military honor. President Truman shook his hand and told him, "I consider this a greater honor than being president." The Medal of Honor citation listed the 75 men Desmond saved on Hacksaw Ridge, but some of the soldiers who were there believed the number was actually higher, perhaps over 100. Desmond himself never claimed an exact number. He just said he was trying to do his duty. After the war, Desmond returned to Virginia, where he lived quietly with his wife, Dorothy. He rarely spoke about his experiences unless asked, and even then, he deflected attention away from himself and toward his faith. He believed deeply that it was God, not himself, who had saved those men on Hacksaw Ridge. He spent his remaining years speaking at churches and schools, not to boast about his accomplishments, but to encourage others to live according to their principles, even when the whole world tells them they're wrong. Desmond Doss lived to see his story told in books and documentaries, though it wouldn't be until 2016, 10 years after his death, that director Mel Gibson would bring his story to millions through the film Hacksaw Ridge. But long before Hollywood recognized him, the men he saved knew exactly who Desmond Doss was. At reunions of the 77th Infantry Division, these combat veterans, hard men who had survived some of the worst fighting of World War II, would seek out Desmond, shake his hand, and thank him for their lives. Some would break down in tears, remembering the moment they lay wounded and dying on top of that ridge, certain they'd been abandoned, only to see Desmond Doss crawling toward them through the fire and smoke, refusing to let them die alone. Desmond Doss passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors in Chattanooga National Cemetery. At his funeral, veterans from across the country came to pay their respects to the man who had proved that the greatest courage doesn't always come from the barrel of a gun. It comes from the strength to stand by your convictions when everyone else tells you you're wrong. It comes from running toward danger when every instinct screams at you to run away. It comes from seeing value in every human life, even when you're surrounded by death. Desmond Doss went to war armed with nothing but his faith, his medical kit, and his unshakable belief that every life was worth saving. And on May 5, 1945, on top of Hacksaw Ridge, while hell itself raged around him, he proved that sometimes the greatest warrior is the one who never fires a shot. He saved 75 men that day, 75 husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers who went home because one man refused to leave them behind. That's not just heroism. That's something beyond heroism. That's the kind of courage that redefines what we think is possible, that challenges us to ask ourselves what we would do when faced with that same choice, to save ourselves or to risk everything for someone else. Desmond Doss made his choice, and 75 families got to see their loved ones again because of it.